Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Loving obeisances unto the Supreme Being Vasudeva, who is everything there is. Janmadhyasya yato anvayaditaratascha artheshu abhignaswarat tene brahmahridaya adikavaye muhyanti yatsuraya tejo vari mridam yatha vinimayo yatra trisargo mrisha dhamna svena sada nirastakuhakam satyam param dhimahi. We meditate upon the transcendent absolute being from whom springs forth this universe. He is present in all that exists and yet distinct from everything. He is fully conscious and totally independent. He revealed to the first seer Brahma the import of Vedic wisdom. The material creation made of threefold gunas appears in him as though real, like water in a mirage. Being eternally self effulgent, he is ever free of the illusion Maya of the material world. We meditate upon him, the Supreme Being. Nigamakalpataror galitam phalam shukamukad amritadrava sanyutam pibata bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho rasika bhuvi bhavukaha. O devotees who relish a taste for divine love, Bhagavatam is the fully ripened fruit of the wish-yielding tree of Vedas, flowing as immortal nectar from Shuka Brahmarshi. Go on drinking the sweet nectar day after day. So now we are entering the 6th chapter of the 5th Skandha of Srimad Bhagavatam. So we saw the story of Rshabha Deva all the way till he becomes a renunciate. He installs his eldest son Bharata, who is a pious Bhagavata, on the throne. Then he leaves. Before that, he gave beautiful instructions on sadhana, and then he leaves, and then he lives as a renunciate, not caring about others either praising him or insulting him, absolutely not being touched by anything, living as a complete renunciate and being totally free. And it was also said that he did not even want any yogic powers that came to him on its own. So this is very common among many, that they find many siddhis, as they are called, yogic powers that manifest, and Lord Rishabhadeva was not interested in that. So we continue now. Parikshit asks a question. He says, for those who have realized the self and who have no desire whatsoever, in other words, those who are completely abiding in total self-realization, God realization, because of the fire of wisdom, which is true yoga, for them, Parikshit says, yogic powers coming or not coming doesn't make any difference normally. So why would the Lord say no to yogic powers? Because if it came on its own, it's all right. And if it doesn't come, it's all right too, normally for a jnani. So why would he be not welcoming it if it came unsolicited? So Shuka replies by saying, yes, you are right, that if it comes on its own, many let it be, but there are also many who intentionally do not want to have anything to do with such powers, because such powers have a way of coming back as vasanas, or coming back as subtle attachments that can make even a great yogi fall down. So the mind is so fickle, Shuka says, that even if one accepts these yogic powers which come unsolicited, over time it can become a kind of attachment, and because of that a great yogi may fall. So this possibility is there, and there are some examples of this too. Because of that, he says a yogi is always extremely alert. So the true highest yogi is the one, the true jnani, which is the same, is one who is extremely alert, that no such feelings of pride or attachment or a sense of being great because of supernatural powers, none of this enters him. And yet, he says, Shukadeva says, the mind is so fickle that it is never to be trusted, and therefore Rishabhadeva set the example by not even accepting these. So this is another important lesson, that many seek supernatural powers and they want to claim that they have some special powers and so on. Here on the other extreme, the supernatural powers came on their own, but Rishabhadeva said no to them because he didn't want to be distracted by any of that. And not only that, the other thing which is also implied here is that many who come to such gurus, even though if the guru is not attached to the supernatural powers, if they come unsolicited, the students, many of them come only for the supernatural powers. They come because this guru can manifest miracles and so on. So they come out of their material desires, and therefore the quality of the disciples is very different. Therefore, this is another reason why, when such supernatural powers are not manifested, even if they come unsolicited, if they are not made a show off in any way, then it ensures that only very serious seekers come and not the worldly people coming for miracles. So, in any case, having described all this, Lord Rishabhadeva's last act, as it were, on earth, sage Shuka says that therefore Rishabhadeva is a very ornament for all sages themselves, and his divine glory could not be perceived by anyone. He was acting like a stupid fellow, as we said, had a weird appearance, he kept silent all the time, and he was not at all attached to anything, and therefore many could not even understand the greatness of him. But he was ever one with the Supreme Spirit, and he had no identification with the body he was moving around. And it is said that he was moving around at that time in what is present day southern India, the provinces of Karnataka and western Tamil Nadu. These are the provinces, in fact, mentioned here. They are called as Konka, Venka, Kutaka, and so on. South Karnataka and present day Coimbatore and these regions of southern India. In these forests he was roaming around, and it is said that while he was roaming around, there was a major forest conflagration of fire due to the bamboos having friction among them. It's a natural forest fire that happens every once in a while, which is actually good for the forests. It regenerates the forest. So in one such forest fire, it's said that Rishabhadeva simply gave up his body being in the forest. So this is the last act of Rshabha. Hearing this, of course, what happened was, it is said that in those provinces, and it spread to other parts of Bharat too, it is said that there was a king called Arhat by name, who first wanted to imitate all this, and therefore he was one of the reasons why a sect arose, and thereby there are a lot of people who try to imitate Rishabhadeva by abandoning their duty, by abandoning the Vedas, and by falling away from standards of purity and conduct as given by the scriptures, by various things such as going around naked and pulling out the hair and so on. It is said that many would reject the Vedas and many would take on this false way of imitating Lord Rishabhadeva, and this goes on. In fact, we see that such things happen with every great personality. The great personality comes and charts his own way of living because he or she lives having tasted the true nature of divine in the way that it naturally manifests, because they are free of any ego. But the followers, without any glimpse into the true divine, they just copy them, imitate them, form a sect, and then cause division further and further. So this is what happens here also. In any case, Shuka concludes this narration of Lord Rishabhadeva by saying, this land of Bharat is so fortunate because every once in a while the great avatars come. He says, of all the dvipas, that is all the continents, and within the continents all the subdivisions called varshas, the greatest is Bharat Varsha because it is so holy that people of this land always have the descents of Murari, he says. Murare karmani badrani avataravanti. So he says the avatars of Sri Murari, which is another name for Krishna, the Supreme Lord. So his supreme avatars. So Rishabhadeva, we saw one more great avatar. We saw Varaha first, we saw Kapila, now we are seeing Rishabhadeva. So Shuka glorifies that this land, Bharatvarsha, he says it's constantly being regenerated by the appearance of such great beings. And also he says, because of this, even the race of Priyavrata is very fortunate, because Bhagavan himself, the supreme being, manifested as Rishabha, who is incomparable, and nobody can ever, no yogi can even follow his footsteps, because he lived a supremely renunciate life, unparalleled. So Shuka concludes this narration by saying, in this way, the narration of Lord Rishabha concludes, and this is a story, he says, that wipes out all sins by simply hearing, because he says again, just as we saw with Kapila or with Varaha, anytime we hear the avatar of the Supreme Being, we first of all see that each avatar is so unique. It manifests a different mood. Teachings are also very unique, and the circumstances are unique. So what is important to recognize here is that we ought not to ever compare, but to just celebrate each avatar for its own glory and for the teachings and for the pastimes, and thereby we can see the common thread between all. So Shuka says here, Shuka Brahmarshi says, listening to this story builds exclusive devotion to Lord Vasudeva in the hearts of those who listen with great reverence, that is Shraddha, and thereby he says they can immerse their soul in the stream of devotion, which is hard to get. And he says that even greater than, as Bhagavatam repeatedly says, even greater than moksha, greater than final beatitude is the current of devotion, because moksha is a goal held by the ego as some kind of final liberation, which is away from this world, whereas pure devotion is to live in this world while being free each moment, by not having any sense of I, but being completely surrendered, being free of the false me, and living as a pure instrument of the divine. So this is greater, therefore, and that's why here also Shuka says that this great supreme devotion, which is even greater than mukti or liberation, is obtained by listening to the story with reverence. He says Krishna will, and he specifically says to Parikshit, Krishna will even bestow mukti, but it's very rare to get the gift of bhakti. He says very nicely, Bhagavan bhajatam mukundo muktim dadati karhichit sma na bhakti yogam. He says Bhagavan bhajatam mukundo. Mukunda, literally the name means one who gives liberation. So he says muktim dadati, he'll give liberation, but bhakti. So here, that's why, as before too, he says mukti is only a state of being that is sought after by the seeker as a final state of liberation, whereas bhakti is a current of living itself, and therefore it's said that bhakti is rarer to get, and such bhakti, he says, is obtained by listening to the story of Rishabha. And therefore he says obeisance to the celebrated Lord Rishabhadeva, who was always free from all cravings, who was rich in internal and external realization, eternally realized in the self, full of compassion, completely free of fear, and who was always especially compassionate to all those whose mind had not even known what is good for them. So people who are not even aware of their own welfare, he was compassionate towards all of them, and thereby his very appearance is a great benediction and blessing for all of earth. So with this, the narration of Rishabhadeva concludes, and then we move to chapter 7, which begins the story of Bharata. Bharata is a great devotee of the Lord, and therefore this story is a very long story after Rishabhadeva. The son of Rishabhadeva is Bharata, as we saw. And so this story begins with this chapter, and it's a very beautiful story with a lot of teachings involved in this. So here Shuka introduces in this chapter the first act of Bharata. He says Bharata becomes the king after Rshabha leaves, and he marries a nice lady, and he has sons, 5 sons. And then he ruled so well that the very land became called as Bharat because of him. We already saw that. It is repeated here again. Ajanabham nama etat varsham bharatam iti yata arabhya vyapadishanti. He says the land. So this is interesting, for many may not be aware that this land of present day India was originally called Ajanabha. And this Ajanabha became Bharat because of this king Bharata. Ajanabam Nama. So the name was Ajanabha. Etad Varsham, this land, Bharatam iti became Bharatam. Yata Arabhya, from whom it started, that is this king Bharata. He was very devout, like his father and grandfather. Father is Rishabha, the supreme being's avatar, and grandfather was Nabhi, as we saw. So just like his lineage, he is a very devoted king who had extensive knowledge, very fond of his subjects, protected his people, did all yajnas with great reverence. But the main important differentiating factor with him is he did the yajnas with a spirit of surrender, not as a ritual, and therefore he did them with perfect reverence, perfect shraddha. And not only that, most importantly, he offered all the rewards of the yajna to the Supreme Lord. So this is the very difference between those who are karmis, who are doing karma with an attachment to karma, that's called karmis, and those who are bhaktas or jnanis, because bhaktas and jnanis are not attached to karma, whereas those who are attached to karma, they want the results of the activities they perform. Whereas here, Bharata, Emperor Bharata, mentally offered the reward, whatever reward is coming. It says, Yat kriya phalam dharmakyam pare brahmani yajna purushe bhagavati vasudeva eva. So he says that the reward of karma, yat kriya phalam, dharmakyam, which is true dharma, he surrendered it to Pare Brahmani Yajna Purusha. He surrendered to the very Lord of the Yajna, which is the Supreme Lord, who is also the doer of the Yajna. So he realized that he is not only the soul of all yajnas, he is not only the head of all yajnas, but he is also the very doer. So Bharata was situated in jnana in this way, recognizing that he was not even the doer of the yajnas, and he was therefore never the one to reap the fruits of the yajnas. So he simply did the yajnas as a beautiful way to maintain order in society, recognizing that the very doer is Vasudeva and the very enjoyer of the fruits is Vasudeva. As Krishna says in the Gita, Bhoktaram Yajnatapasam Sarvaloka Maheshwaram. He says, one who knows me as the doer and the enjoyer of all yajnas is free. So here that's the knowledge in which Bharata is, Emperor Bharata. He recognizes the Supreme Lord as the doer and the enjoyer of all sacrifices. And not only that, all the other deities that are invoked in the yajna, he never saw them as separate. He saw them as parts of or limbs of the Supreme Being. So this is very important too. Many people get confused and bewildered with all the various deities rather invoked in yajna, and they think there are many deities, and then they have different desires for different deities and so on. Here Bharata sets the right example by showing that all the Vedic deities are parts of the one Supreme Being. There is only one Supreme Being, and the deities are like limbs of the Supreme Being. So all the sacrificial offerings to the various deities, he offered to them, fully recognizing that every one of them is the limb of the Supreme Being. So he was only offering everything to the Supreme Lord. So thus his mind was extremely purified in loving devotion to Lord Vasudeva, and he felt in his very heart the presence of the Supreme Being and the form of Paramatma, as we have seen described before, with the 4 arms and with beautiful forest flowers, and with the 4 arms having Shanka, Chakra, Gada, Padma, that is the conch shell, the Sudarshan Chakra wheel, the mace, and the lotus flower, and the beautiful yellow silk garment. All of this with the divine transcendent form was visualized by him in his very heart. And with this, he was living beautifully, ruling the kingdom. And then, after ruling for a long time, when the time came, just as his forefathers, he also gave his kingdom to his sons. And then he left the kingdom and he went to the hermitage of the sage Pulaha, which is on the banks of the river Gandaki. So, Gandaki is in present day Nepal, which is also part of Bharat and a very holy province. And therefore, Gandaki river, and especially it's known for being a Salagrama Kshetra, that is the land, the river from where the stones Salagrama come, which are considered the natural form of the Supreme Being and worshipped as such. So, the river Gandaki, the Salagrama Kshetra, which is where the ashram of Pulaha was, this is where our Emperor Bharata now retires, and it is said that this river, especially Gandaki river, where he did penance, is a place where one can, even today, any time, feel the presence of the Supreme Lord Sri Hari, because, as we said, the very stones of this river, which have very special marks, these are very famous too. The marks of the stones that are in this river Gandaki, it's also called Chakra Nadi. Chakra Nadi literally means the river of the wheel. So it is said to be the wheel of Sudarshana Chakra, the wheel of the Supreme Being. And this very river therefore carries these stones that have the markings which signify the Supreme Lord, and they are found even today, and they are taken by devotees to worship the Salagrama, very special stones. So this land, this river Gandaki, where these holy salagramas are found, this is where Emperor Bharata retires and he engages in worship there. He is doing beautiful worship. He is offering basil plant and water and roots and fruits to the deity he has installed there, and he is free of all cravings for any kind of sensory pleasures, and he is very tranquil, very peaceful, very even minded, and his heart is completely melted in devotion. He has complete love for the Lord. As we already saw, he ruled also with total sense of non-doership, and now he was completely free of all responsibilities, and he was engaged in very loving, heart-melting devotion, with his eyes filled with tears of love, and his consciousness always being drowned in his heart, one with the Supreme Lord, and thereby he was always living a very transcendent, ecstatic life. He was only wearing deer skin, it is said, and he was having matted hair, and he was performing ablutions in the river there regularly, and he was shining radiantly in his appearance, wearing this deer skin and with his matted hair and like an ascetic royal sage now. And he was also worshipping the sun as the form of the Supreme Being. And with this chapter concludes with the prayer to the sun, which is actually an invocation of the Gayatri Mantra, which is mentioned here without mentioning the Gayatri Mantra, but the equivalent of it. So the mantra is Pararojas Savitur Jata Vedo Devasya Bhargo Manasedam Jajana Sureta Sadah Punaravishya Chaste Hamsam Gridhranam Nirish Dring Garamimaha. That means the light of the sun, which dispenses the fruit of all our actions, is the same light that is coming from the Supreme Being, the inner controller, which protects the jiva, and it is the very power of consciousness. We resort to the light which propels our intellect. So, this is pretty much the same meaning of Gayatri Mantra. Gayatri Mantra is not to be normally said aloud except coming from a guru, and therefore here also in Bhagavatam Gayatri Mantra is not given directly, but the equivalent of Gayatri Mantra with the same meaning is given here, worshipping the sun not as a separate deity again, But recognizing that sun is what powers the whole universe, and the very light of sun is the light of consciousness, because there is nothing other than the Supreme Being who powers everything, including the sun. And therefore, offering one's gratitude and prayers to the sun every morning and afternoon and at dusk, to the sun as the manifest form of the Supreme Being, and thereby having purification of the intellect. This is the essence of Gayatri Mantra, which is given here. And with this chapter concludes. Now we will see the continuation of Bharata's story, what happens as he lives here in this beautiful hermitage by Gandaki river, and what are the interesting episodes that come out of that will be seen in the following chapters. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.